They mocked his shoes, sneered at his coat, questioned his ticket, and laughed like wolves when he was dragged from his seat. Because to them, a black man in first class was an offense, not a mistake. They didn't whisper. They didn't hide it. They humiliated him out loud, in front of a cabin full of silence and smirks. Not one person stood up. Not one apology was offered. He was told he was in the wrong place, the wrong row, the wrong world. He said nothing. He just watched. And what they saw as weakness was the last quiet moment before everything they trusted began to fall apart. This isn't just a flight. It's a trap they built for someone they thought was beneath them, and they walked straight into it. You want to know what happens when the man they dismissed is the only one with the power to decide their future? Then don't blink. This series will take you into every twisted detail they tried to keep hidden. Like the video, subscribe for the full breakdown, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And how far would you go to keep your dignity at 30,000 feet? Thane Garrison stood at the threshold of the first-class cabin with a posture molded by years of silent endurance. His coat, worn but clean, clung to his frame with the stubbornness of something that had seen too many seasons. In one hand, a soft canvas bag bearing the faded scuffs of time. In the other, a boarding pass stamped with the unmistakable clarity of 1A. He stepped forward the way he did everything, quietly, without apology, aware of every eye that might follow his every move. The cabin ahead was a polished monument to exclusivity. Cream leather seats lined in brass trim, armrests that gleamed like jewelry. The air, artificially crisp, carried the faint scent of lavender and lemon. It was luxury curated to remind you that only a certain kind of person belonged here. She was waiting at the entrance, tall, rigid, framed by the cold precision of her Navy uniform. Marla. Her name tag was pinned perfectly straight. Her expression was not. The moment her eyes met Thane's, something invisible and ugly formed in the air between them. She didn't smile, didn't greet him. Her gaze dropped, scanning his chest, his collar, his hands. He could feel the judgment curling like smoke behind her eyes. Before he could speak, she raised a hand. Not high, not sudden, just firm. A practiced gesture. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again, sir." He handed it over wordlessly. She stared at it longer than necessary. Not out of confusion, out of disbelief. Her mouth pulled slightly as if something about it amused her. She looked back up. "Please wait here while I confirm this." She didn't ask him to step aside. She expected it. Thane obeyed. He always had. In lines, in lobbies, in life. Around him, passengers filtered into the cabin without issue. A man in a turtleneck gave a polite nod as he passed. A woman in pearl smiled, then glanced down at his shoes and said nothing. From behind, someone whispered the word upgrade. The laugh that followed was brief but full. Thane didn't turn around. He had learned not to. 10 minutes passed. Marla returned without the tablet she'd left with, without any apology, without explanation. Her eyes didn't meet his. "Come with me, please." He followed. No questions, no hesitation. She walked down the aisle fast, as though the distance between him and his true place on the plane was a thing she needed to shorten. They passed rows of passengers already sipping wine and reclining into their private bubbles. He could feel the stares, not out of interest, but irritation, as though he were the thing out of place. She stopped near the back. Row 34. Middle seat. Here. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She vanished behind the curtain before he'd even sat down. Thane lowered himself carefully into the seat. The man beside him shifted visibly, turning his knees away, pressing an elbow to the window. There was no space for his bag above, so he tucked it beneath his feet. He folded his coat onto his lap. It didn't matter. He could feel the weight of all of it. Every moment like this he'd buried behind clenched teeth and lowered eyes. His boarding pass was still in his hand. He stared at it. For a long time. The captain's voice broke through the silence with a practiced ease. The flight would be smooth, the weather fair, the destination clear. Thane didn't hear it. Not really. What he heard was Marla's silence. What he saw was her smirk when she looked at his coat. What he remembered, what stayed, was the deliberate way she had moved past what was printed on paper, what had been paid for, what was owed. She saw a man she didn't think belonged, so she made sure he didn't. Thane turned toward the window and rested his temple against the glass. It was cool, firm, familiar. There were no words. Not yet. There was just this feeling that even now, even here, thousands of feet above the clouds, he still had to fight for the right to sit in a seat he had already paid for. The cold seeped into his forehead from the window as he watched the edge of the terminal vanish. His knuckles were white, clenched around the paper that no longer meant anything. He remembered the voice of the woman behind him earlier, the laughter in her throat when she said, he probably saved up a year for that seat. He hadn't. But that didn't matter. Her assumption was louder than fact, louder than his restraint, louder than truth. Marla passed through the aisle once more, headed toward the rear galley. She didn't look at him, didn't see him. Not really. Her back was as straight as her judgment. Another attendant walked past, glancing at his row, paused for half a breath, and kept going. No offer of a drink. No acknowledgement. Not even the routine smile they gave strangers out of habit. Thane was not invisible. He was unwanted, different, displaced. He could feel the way they'd written a story about him without asking for a single word. And that story was winning. Every quiet moment of dismissal was a chapter. Every sideways glance, a paragraph. He turned his gaze back to the window, not looking through it, but into it, at his reflection, the lines at the corners of his mouth, the rough beard he hadn't shaved in 3 days, the eyes that knew too well what it meant to sit quietly and let others decide where he was allowed to exist. Somewhere toward the front, laughter erupted again. Her perfume smelled expensive, but her expressions were cheap, each glance toward him a quiet condemnation. He adjusted his coat to avoid brushing against her, but the gesture seemed only to deepen her scowl. She shifted away with deliberate drama, muttering just loud enough. You'd think by now people would understand where they belong. Thane didn't respond. He stared out the window at the gray of cloud cover smearing the edges of the sky. His original seat in first class remained a ghost in his mind, an empty throne that had been taken from him not for lack of merit, but because someone had decided he didn't look the part. The truth gnawed at him. No one had taken that seat. Marla hadn't escorted anyone important into it. It was empty by design. His removal was not an error. It was a message. The cabin was tight, humid with breath and artificial air. The vent above him dripped intermittently, sending cold droplets onto his collar. He didn't move, didn't wipe them away. The sensation kept him grounded, a reminder that his reality was not the polished narrative playing out in the front cabin. A flight attendant rolled a cart past his knee with little regard for space, nudging his arm without apology. The woman beside him glanced at the damp patch on his coat and sniffed with quiet satisfaction. That's what happens when you force yourself into places you don't fit, she whispered. Her voice was venom sugar-coated with civility. I saw the way they looked at you. You were lucky they let you board. Thane didn't flinch, but something in his grip around his bag tightened. The comment didn't surprise him. It confirmed what the silence of the others had already shouted. When the snack service began, the same attendant who had bumped him earlier offered crackers to the row ahead, smiled at the row across, and skipped his row entirely. He watched her pass, watched her stop 2 rows down to ask if a passenger needed anything else. She looked back once, caught his eyes, then looked away without acknowledgement. He could hear laughter up front, the clink of utensils on porcelain. He could smell warm bread and roasted meat drifting from the premium section. A slow burn built in his chest, not of hunger, but of humiliation seasoned over time. Hours passed. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Lights dimmed. A child behind him kicked his seat twice before being hushed. Thane didn't move. The overhead speaker clicked on with a burst of static as the pilot made an announcement about turbulence. His voice was smooth, measured, the sound of someone in control. Thane wondered how often that man had been questioned about his authority. He wondered if the captain's skin tone had ever determined where he was allowed to sit. As the plane began to descend, the lights brightened slightly. A few passengers stretched and gathered their things. The woman beside him remained rigid. Her posture was military, her voice colder now. "You must have done something wrong to end up here," she said, her eyes not meeting his. "People like you don't just get moved unless there's a reason." Thane's voice, when it came, was steady and low. "People like me?" She blinked, startled by the directness. "You know what I mean." "I do," he said. And then he turned back to the window. Silence thickened between them like fog. A minute passed. Then 5. She fidgeted, cleared her throat, but said nothing more. As the wheels hit the runway and the jet slowed to a crawl, Thane felt the inertia press against his chest. It was not the descent that rattled him, but the weight of what he carried back down to earth. His dignity, bent but not broken. His anger, silent but smoldering. And his memory, sharp, photographic, unforgiving. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a scene. But every slight, every look, every comment had etched itself into him with surgical precision. When the seatbelt sign blinked off and passengers began standing, the woman next to him reached up for her bag. She paused, looked at him. "I hope you find peace," she said. Her voice trembled slightly now, as if she realized too late that he had never once deserved her contempt. He didn't answer, not out of malice, but because her words had come too late. He stood slowly, stretching his back, reaching for his bag without a sound. A young flight attendant near the back offered a nod as he passed. It was the first acknowledgement he'd received all flight. He didn't return it. As he walked toward the exit, past row after row of relaxed faces and glowing screens, the curtain to first class remained drawn shut. A barrier not of fabric, but of perception. Behind it, his seat still waited, empty, untouched, reserved not for someone important, but for someone acceptable. At the gate, Marla stood beside the exit door. Her hands were clasped, her expression passive. As he approached, she avoided his eyes. She said nothing. He paused just long enough to speak. "You left it empty." She stiffened. "It wasn't personal." He nodded. "No, it never is." Then he stepped past her and out into the terminal, his figure tall and deliberate against the tide of moving bodies. He had come on this flight to return home, but somewhere at 30,000 feet, the meaning of that word had shifted. He didn't feel welcomed. He didn't feel grounded. Thane sat stiffly in his reassigned seat near the rear lavatory, his shoulders brushing the cold curve of the aircraft wall, his eyes locked ahead on the back of a torn headrest, while turbulence beyond the windows gently rocked the plane as if the sky itself were sighing in boredom. Minutes passed in slow-motion silence, until familiar footsteps returned, crisp and unmistakable, accompanied now by another pair, heavier, slower, but laced with the same authoritative gait that believed its presence never needed explanation. Marla was back, standing just beside his row, flanked by a younger male attendant whose expression mirrored the smug neutrality of someone trained to enforce rules without confronting their meaning. They didn't greet him, didn't speak right away. Instead, they stood there as if expecting the sight of their uniforms alone to prompt obedience. "Excuse me, sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" the male attendant finally said, his voice slick with artificial politeness as he leaned slightly forward, his arms crossed casually, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of pressure. Thane didn't move. "We've received a concern from another guest regarding their level of comfort," he added, as though discomfort were a matter of air temperature or legroom rather than the skin tone of the man nearby. Marla remained silent, her eyes darting across the faces around them to gauge attention, then falling coldly back on Thane, who asked simply, "And what exactly makes someone uncomfortable now?" The man hesitated only a breath before continuing. "It's nothing personal, sir. These situations can be delicate, and we want to ensure all passengers enjoy a pleasant experience." Across the aisle, an elderly woman with perfectly curled hair and too much perfume leaned toward them, her voice cutting through the cabin like a blade wrapped in lace. "You must understand," she said to Thane, without invitation. "Some of us pay for peace, not disruption." Her smile was thin and sharp, and her words were laced with the kind of condescension only confidence and decades of unchecked entitlement could produce. Thane stared at her. He didn't respond, not because he lacked words, but because hers were not worth answering. The male attendant gestured slightly toward the aisle. "We'd be happy to find you a new seat, one with more privacy." "Or one further from her," Thane replied, not raising his voice, not shifting in posture, but letting the truth rest plainly between them. The man flinched. "We simply ask for cooperation," he replied, voice tightening. "I'm already seated," Thane said. "I'm cooperating." Marla's patience thinned visibly, though her lips never moved. The man tried again. "Please, sir. Just for the comfort of everyone." Thane stood slowly, not in compliance, but in quiet defiance. He retrieved his bag, nodded once, not to them, but to himself, and stepped into the aisle. He followed them without speaking, moving past passengers who watched with a mixture of curiosity, relief, or veiled superiority. They walked him further back, this time to the final row of the plane, near the engines where the vibrations rattled through the floor, a place where the hum of flight masked the sounds of contempt. As he sat again, one row ahead of a snoring passenger and a flickering overhead light, the male attendant muttered something about compensation. Thane didn't reply. He stared at his own hands resting on his knees, the same hands that had built, led, and endured. Hands that once held contracts, shook the palms of diplomats, sketched out futures, now reduced to gripping armrests in the shadows of privilege. The cabin dimmed further as the plane cruised into steady altitude. The attendants disappeared behind curtains. The woman from earlier remained in first class, sipping wine, retelling her triumphs to an audience that didn't mind the punchline. But back in the corner of the aircraft, Thane sat still, not tired, not broken, but calculating. Every detail, every movement, every phrase had been recorded in his memory with clarity sharpened by years of repetition. These people were not original, their methods not creative, their words not even new. They repeated the script society handed them generations ago, revised only in accent, not intent. Another passenger beside him, a young man in a hoodie, leaned slightly toward him. "That was messed up, man," he said. "You handled it better than I could have." Thane gave the faintest nod, but said nothing. Kindness from strangers, though appreciated, did not undo the act. Though the lights in the cabin had dimmed, though most passengers had settled into screens or sleep or conversation, Marla returned. She appeared out of the dark like a shadow with intent, stopping a few rows ahead, murmuring quietly with a male attendant from earlier, their eyes flicking back toward him as if planning how to rearrange his dignity just one more time. When she finally reached his row, she held a cloth napkin in one hand and a small bottle of water in the other, her wrist bent as though the items were unclean, her posture exaggerated to avoid contact. She handed the bottle first, then paused before offering the napkin. "Do you know how to use these?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet, her expression painted with fake innocence, but her eyes sharp and cruel. "Or do you prefer the ones from bus terminals?" The question dropped like a stone in still water. No one in the nearby rows moved. No one defended him. The air tightened around him, every breath laced with shame not of his own making. His hand reached for the napkin without a word. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, with the precision of a surgeon rather than someone reduced to caricature. He wiped a droplet of condensation from his coat with a soft white linen, then folded the cloth again, returning it to the tray table, as if it were a relic undeserving of her touch. Marla watched, waiting for a response, but he gave her nothing. Her smirk faltered. She turned to leave, but hadn't taken 2 steps, when a voice rang out from the front of the cabin. "What the hell's going on back there?" It was a man's voice, brash, unfiltered, the sound of wealth unburdened by empathy. Why do they even let people like that into first class in the first place? His voice carried with the clarity of privilege, unashamed and unchecked, designed to be overheard and validated. A few passengers chuckled, not loudly, not fully, but enough for Thane to hear the echo of every joke ever told at his expense. "You give them one taste of comfort and they think they run the place," the voice added. Thane didn't rise. He didn't look back, but the sting burned fresh. His chest tightened with something ancient and raw, something that had slept quietly in him for years, but had never gone away. His mind conjured the face of the speaker without seeing it. Slicked back hair, pressed collar, the smirk of a man who had never been told no by the world and didn't expect to start now. Marla paused mid-step. She said nothing. The male attendant said nothing. No one said anything, because nothing was ever said in those moments. The laughter filled the silence instead, polite and poisonous. Thane's gaze dropped to the napkin again. Still folded, still clean, still used as a weapon without leaving a mark. The plane shook slightly from a pocket of turbulence, and with it, his thoughts shifted to the absurdity of the situation, of being thousands of feet in the air, yet still chained to the ground by the judgments of others. The man's voice rose again, now clearly addressing someone beside him. Back in my day, they wouldn't even be allowed past security. Now they're demanding caviar like it's their birthright. More laughter followed, louder this time, emboldened by the lack of consequence. A flight attendant too rose, a head turned slightly, heard the remark, and did nothing. Her gaze returned to her tablet. She adjusted her hair. The world moved on. In the seat next to Thane, a middle-aged woman who had been silent the entire flight shifted uncomfortably, her hands clenching around the armrest. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak. But she no longer leaned into the aisle. She shrank. That, too, was a language he understood. When the captain announced the descent, his voice was firm and polite, unaware of the quiet war playing out in the cabin he commanded. Marla returned one final time to offer breath mints to the passengers in the rear. When she reached Thane, she paused, extended the silver tray, and then, without waiting, moved on. He didn't reach for the mint. He watched her retreat, her shoulders stiff, her movements robotic now, her mask cracking around the edges. And still, no one apologized. No one addressed the man whose voice had carved wounds into the atmosphere like smoke across a clean sky. As the wheels touched down and the plane slowed, Thane closed his eyes. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. It was the orchestrated approval, the group complicity, the cowardice of silence dressed as neutrality. When the aircraft docked and the doors opened, he remained seated as others rushed to stand. The man who had spoken stood 2 rows ahead, stretching, laughing, patting another man on the back like a soldier returning from a victorious campaign. Thane waited. Let the cabin empty. Let them pass. He had no desire to walk the gauntlet of their glances, their mockery, their comfort in ignorance. He stepped out only when the cabin was nearly clear, his gait calm, his posture unchanged. But something had shifted. Thane exited the jet bridge into a concourse bathed in the artificial glow of overhead lights and sterile tile, his feet carrying him with the precision of muscle memory rather than will, his thoughts still rooted in the space he had just left, where words like daggers had been tossed with such ease that their cruelty felt rehearsed, not spontaneous, as if the actors had simply been waiting for the curtain to rise. He moved in silence toward the lounge designated for premium travelers, a space he had every right to enter. And yet as he crossed the threshold, the woman behind the counter hesitated, glanced at his coat, then at his face, then down at her monitor before waving him through without a word. Inside, the world pretended to be calm, chairs upholstered in soft leather, glasses clinking with expensive liquids, conversations carried on in subdued tones by those who had long since forgotten the cost of comfort. Thane took a seat near the window, not because he wanted the view, but because it gave him space, distance from eyes that still lingered too long and smiles that carried questions behind them. A young boy wandered near, maybe 6 or 7, trailing behind his mother who was engaged in a call and barely paying attention. The boy pointed directly at Thane and asked loudly, "Mom, why is that dark man in here? I thought this was the good seats." The words cut through the quiet like a thunderclap, freezing half a dozen conversations mid-sentence, the kind of silence that doesn't scream but judges. The mother, without lowering her phone or changing her tone, replied, "Sometimes they give away spots for charity, sweetie. Don't stare." Thane didn't move. He didn't blink. He stared ahead as if the boy hadn't spoken, as if the woman's voice hadn't been dipped in sugar and salt at the same time, as if every word she said didn't reaffirm everything that had just happened on the flight before. But his fingers, resting on his knee, curled ever so slightly. A quiet compression of fury, not rage. Something colder, more precise. Marla entered the lounge 5 minutes later, now out of uniform, but still wearing the same tight-lipped smirk, walking beside a younger flight attendant with nervous energy and wide eyes. They didn't notice Thane at first. He sat partially in shadow, his presence cloaked by the very assumptions they had made about him since the moment he boarded. Marla gestured toward the service counter and said, "You see that? That's why you always triple-check upgrades. You let one slip through, and it makes the entire cabin feel off." The new attendant nodded quickly, eager to learn, eager to belong. "We were told to watch for discrepancies," she said, "but I didn't know it could be that subtle." Marla laughed once, low and clipped. "It's never about the clothes. It's in how they carry themselves. When they don't defer, that's the warning sign." The words rolled through the room like invisible gas, not loud, not overt, but toxic all the same. Thane rose slowly from his seat. They hadn't seen him yet. He walked past them as if he were invisible, which to them, he might as well have been. As he reached the hallway toward the connecting gate, he heard Marla say, "You see someone sitting up straight like they own the place, and you check their boarding pass twice." Every time. The hallway curved, and her voice faded. He kept walking. The gate for the next flight was already boarding. He scanned the rows and saw his name already marked as checked in. First class again. Automatically. The airline's internal system didn't know how to discriminate. It only responded to value. And Thane, regardless of what they believed, held value they couldn't erase with smug looks and whispered commentary. As he entered the cabin, he took his assigned seat without hesitation. The window seat, second row. A man beside him gave a polite nod, then returned to reading. The flight attendant passed without comment. For now, everything was quiet, but his mind was not. He replayed the voice of the child, the phrasing of the mother, the brittle laugh of Marla, the instructions passed to the eager rookie. They had reduced his existence to an error, an intrusion, a thing that slipped through their net of expectation. Not because he had done anything, but because he hadn't apologized for being where they didn't want him. That was his crime. He had boarded with confidence. He had sat upright. He hadn't looked away. The plane began taxiing. His reflection in the window looked back at him, older than he remembered, not from years, but from moments like these, where 1,000 cuts left no blood, but still managed to scar. He had stayed silent, not because he couldn't speak. Thane sat in his first-class seat on the final leg of his journey, staring blankly at the tray in front of him where the meal had been served cold and late. The sauce congealed into a dull film over the meat. The bread dry and cracked like it had spent more time in storage than on a plate, and the glass of water placed before him, without ice, without lemon, without care. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken. He had simply sat, upright and composed, the perfect model of restraint while the murmurs around him rippled like quiet waves of disgust masked his conversation, the passengers around him never daring to speak to him directly, but making no effort to lower their voices either. This airline used to mean something, one man said 3 rows ahead. Now they'll sell a premium seat to anyone with a few points and a loud complaint. A woman 2 rows behind Thane had said, "It's not about color, it's about class," and then added without irony, "But let's be honest, class is earned, not handed out." He had heard all of it. Every word, every smirk, every fork dropped with passive aggression, and every glance that scanned his shoes, his coat, the neat fade of his hairline, looking for clues that he did not belong. But he gave them nothing. No response. No emotion. Only silence, because silence, he had learned, was the most threatening form of dignity. Veronica, the lead attendant on this flight, had been watching him since boarding. She had greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and had passed his seat 5 times before takeoff, as though waiting for a reason to correct him, as though waiting for a mistake that never came. Now, as the captain's voice came over the speaker to announce their descent, her posture shifted. Her pace slowed. Her presence lingered just a little longer by his row, as if preparing for something, as if waiting for the signal. As the wheels touched down and the cabin jolted softly, Veronica disappeared behind the front curtain, speaking in hushed tones to the other attendants, nodding once, quickly. Thane didn't move. He watched the movement with stillness, every muscle in his body quiet but alert, every part of him aware that whatever was coming would be neither sudden nor subtle. The plane came to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign went off, but the front door did not open. Passengers murmured. Some stood. Others waited. Then, 2 uniformed officers boarded the aircraft and moved deliberately down the aisle toward row 2A, toward Thane. He did not flinch. He did not speak. Veronica followed behind them, her voice just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. We've had a report of a behavioral concern. Standard protocol. The phrase landed with practiced weight. She didn't need to explain what behavior. She didn't need to cite a rule. The ambiguity was the weapon. Thane turned his head slightly toward the officers and said, "Is there a charge?" One officer looked uncertain. The other said, "Just a few questions, sir. Please come with us." The nearby passengers reacted instantly. One man stood and clapped slowly, mockingly, and said, "Finally, someone's doing something." A woman behind him muttered, "He thought he could just sit there like he owned it." Another added, "Veronica handled that with class. She always keeps the standards high." The officers didn't touch Thane. He stood on his own, gathered his coat, placed his bag over one shoulder, and walked the aisle with a pace that refused to quicken, each step deliberate, his chin high, his gaze straight. The passengers parted to let him pass, but not without commentary. "It's not personal," someone whispered. "It's just business. People like that never know their place," another said. "She should get a raise," a man told his wife, gesturing to Veronica. She kept this flight from turning into a circus. Veronica stood at the doorway as he passed. She didn't look at him. She looked past him, as if he were a shadow and she was already basking in the light. But he saw her fingers twitch. Just once. Just enough. In the jet bridge, the officers gestured toward the side wall and asked him to wait. One pulled out a small notepad, then looked to the other, clearly unsure how to proceed. "What's the issue?" Thane asked again. The officer hesitated. They said there was discomfort. Unspecified. Just tension. Thane nodded once, then said, "So no incident?" "No, sir. No complaint. None formally. Just a concern." "Then I'll go." The officers didn't stop him. He stepped around them and continued walking, past the gate agents who had watched everything with the bored disinterest of people used to watching others be humiliated, past the cleaning crew standing to the side who didn't speak, but whose eyes followed him with something more complex than pity. When he exited into the terminal, the noise of the airport returned, but it was nothing compared to the noise inside him. He kept walking, not fast, not slow, just steady. Behind him, Veronica returned to the plane, receiving pats on the back, nods of approval, compliments from passengers who thanked her for maintaining the integrity of the brand. One man said, "You saved this airline a PR disaster." Another whispered, "She's exactly the kind of professional we need more of." Thane stepped away from the crowd of uniformed officers and murmuring passengers, his coat draped over one arm, his bag balanced effortlessly in his hand, and though the corridor around him buzzed with movement and confusion, he moved like a man completely undisturbed, his posture calm, his steps unhurried, his eyes sharp and unwavering as he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a slim black phone, unlocked it with a practiced swipe, and pressed a number already memorized, a line that was never to be dialed unless everything that needed to be proven had been made irrefutable. The phone rang once, then connected, and he said only one sentence, steady, quiet, cutting through space like a blade. "Proceed with the plan. We have all we need." Then he hung up, slipped the phone back into his coat, and continued walking, not toward baggage claim, not toward the exit signs blinking with commercial normalcy, but toward a corridor marked restricted access, where no passengers wandered and few staff ever walked without clearance, where silence reigned except for the subtle buzz of fluorescent lights overhead and the quiet hum of surveillance unseen but ever present. And when he reached the end of that corridor, the doors parted automatically, and outside, beneath the dark glass of the terminal windows, a black limousine waited at the edge of the tarmac, its polished body gleaming beneath the overcast sky like a promise, like a reckoning. The rear door opened as he approached, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his frame broad, his bearing military, his face unreadable but unmistakably aware. He carried a black leather briefcase, and in his other hand, a folder marked with the insignia of the United States Department of Defense. Thane nodded once as they exchanged glances, and the man responded in kind, turning toward the approaching officers who had followed Thane at a distance, still unsure, still clinging to protocol, still unaware that their authority had already expired the moment they stepped off the plane. The man in the suit raised one hand and said firmly but without aggression, "This man is not to be detained. He is under the direct protection of the United States government, and any attempt to delay his movement will result in immediate federal oversight." Then he opened a folder and held it out, revealing contract signed, sealed, and stamped, the ink still fresh, but the weight of the documents older than any of the uniforms present. Thane Garrison, listed as Chief Strategic Liaison to the Department of Defense, primary architect of a classified multinational aerospace contract, overseeing $2.8 billion in technology integration, national security logistics, and advanced air command systems. The project's success depended not just on technical execution, but on ethical alignment with American values, including the conduct and integrity of its civilian transport partners. The officers hesitated, looked at each other, then stepped back, their voices caught somewhere between apology and awe. But Thane offered no acknowledgement. He stepped toward the limousine as the driver emerged from the front, opened the door, and nodded respectfully. "Sir, we're ready." The man in the suit remained behind, handing the folder to airport security, instructing them to copy and distribute the contents to all senior stakeholders within the airline by end of day, his voice carrying the calm finality of someone used to irreversible orders. Inside the limousine, the silence was luxurious, the windows soundproof, the seats leather-wrapped and wide. But Thane did not lean back, did not relax. He simply placed his bag beside him, reached for a new device from a compartment under the armrest, and began reviewing a live feed, multiple angles, high resolution, time-stamped, audio synced, the entire flight, from gate to descent, captured through surveillance embedded into every corner of the aircraft. Footage triggered only under specific parameters which had been deliberately designed to activate under circumstances exactly like what had transpired, not just for security, but for accountability. And Thane had written those protocols himself years earlier, not out of paranoia, but because he knew the world too well to leave justice to trust alone. He watched as Marla examined his ticket with thinly veiled disdain, watched her consult with the male attendant, watched them fabricate the seating error, watched as the passengers whispered, scoffed, laughed, cheered when he was led away. And he noted each face, each comment, each decision, not with vengeance, but with precision, the kind of precision that turned consequence from theory into policy. He pressed a button on the panel, connected to a secure call line, and spoke without preamble. Initiate the internal audit, distribute the footage to the board and the press team simultaneously, remove redactions, let the full truth speak, and add one more line to the memo. The following flight crew and passengers are hereby prohibited from using any future services operated by our network until formal review is complete. Full list attached. Then he ended the call and exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in finality. The silence that follows decision, not debate. The limousine began to move, slowly at first, then steady, passing the edge of the terminal, rounding the tarmac. And as it passed gate B-17, where the original incident began, the windows reflected the blinking lights of police vehicles and the confused faces of airport staff, still wondering how something so ordinary had turned so suddenly irreversible. Inside the first-class lounge, Veronica stood surrounded by passengers still singing her praises, calling her brave, principled, and enforced her standards, her smile tight, her spine straight, but her eyes twitching every time a phone buzzed or a screen lit up. And when one of the supervisors pulled her aside and handed her a printed statement marked urgent, her fingers trembled just slightly as she read, her lips parting slowly as the meaning of the words sank in. Effective immediately. Under federal advisory, your employment has been suspended pending investigation. Do not return to your scheduled flight. Rotation. Surrender your company ID and credentials. Await further contact from legal counsel. She looked up, eyes searching the crowd, but the cheers had already faded. The passengers backing away slowly, their smiles gone, their support evaporated, not out of guilt, but out of self-preservation. And as she stood there alone, badge in hand, her world no longer aligned with the one she had controlled only hours earlier. She saw the news alert flash across a nearby screen. Airline CEO to issue. Public statement following discrimination scandal involving senior flight staff and government contractor. And the photo they used was not of Thane walking through security or sitting in a rear row, but of him at a global conference 6 months earlier, shaking hands with cabinet officials, leading a keynote on ethical innovation in national defense, standing tall in a tailored suit. The limousine continued gliding across the tarmac while the world outside began shifting in real time. Screens lit up in terminals across the country. Push notifications pinged on phones. Emergency meetings were called in glass conference rooms from Manhattan to Los Angeles, while legal teams scrambled through internal databases to cross-check the faces, names, and actions caught in high-resolution clarity during a flight that had now become the centerpiece of a national scandal. News anchors adjusted their ties. Reporters rehearsed phrasing like exclusive footage obtained and source confirms whistleblower is high-ranking executive, while thumbnails featuring still frames of Thane being escorted by uniformed officers exploded across the internet. And as trending hashtags consumed the top 5 spots across platforms, phrases like silent dignity, billion-dollar backlash, and corporate morality test pushed celebrity gossip and political chatter to the sidelines. Because what had started as an anonymous act of discrimination had become a symbol, a mirror held up to a system too comfortable in its cruelty. Inside the limousine, Thane remained composed, his fingers moving fluidly across a digital panel embedded in the armrest as he reviewed timestamps, redacted passenger data, and a legal summary drafted and finalized within the hour by his personal counsel, who had been instructed to issue a statement to the press that would offer not apology but revelation, one that began not with defense but with clarity. And as the car slowed near a private terminal, the kind reserved only for heads of state and high-risk diplomatic operations, a team of suited staff waited under a curved glass awning, holding devices, adjusting earpieces, preparing for what would not be a response but a declaration. Thane stepped out, straightened his collar, and walked through a private corridor into a media room already staged with a podium, lights, and a sea of reporters who had been summoned without explanation, but arrived in minutes once the first alerts broke. He stood behind the podium as silence fell and cameras aligned. And when he spoke, the room held its breath. This flight was not a routine booking. It was an ethics audit disguised as a standard itinerary, initiated by the Oversight Division of our Defense Logistics Team in cooperation with the Department of Transportation and Civilian Oversight Council. For the past 6 months, we have been monitoring behavioral trends in elite service sectors, specifically targeting indicators of implicit bias, exclusionary conduct, and unethical treatment of clients based on demographic assumptions. The plane you saw, the staff you watched, the decisions they made, were all recorded under federal protocol. And every action they took was their own, uninfluenced, uncoached, and unprompted. What you witnessed is not an outlier. It is the norm exposed. He paused, scanning the sea of lenses and blinking record lights, then continued. The individuals in question did not fail a customer service metric. They failed a moral benchmark, and because they failed, we will not proceed with the current contract under negotiation. Our projected investment of $2.8 billion in fleet expansion, cybersecurity integration, and commercial partnership will be redirected to firms demonstrating active accountability frameworks and anti-discrimination commitments at the operational level. The room erupted, flashes fired, questions shouted, reporters surged forward. But Thane did not linger. He turned and exited through a side corridor while the statement echoed across every major broadcast, split-screened with footage of Marla escorting him from the cabin. The male attendant watching, the passengers commenting, each moment now dissected in real time by analysts and human rights advocates and political commentators who debated the implications not only for the airline, but for the entire culture of service-based power dynamics. Meanwhile, Veronica, seated alone in an office no longer hers, watched as every internal communication log, every report she had filed, every discrepancy she had dismissed, was unearthed and cross-examined by people whose titles included terms like compliance investigator and federal liaison. She watched as the company's public stock tumbled within hours, not just from the backlash, but from the withdrawal of government support, from the shareholders demanding answers, from the headlines that read failure at 30,000 feet, not a tragedy, but a test they thought they would never have to take, and failed anyway. Thane, meanwhile, arrived at a high-security executive center, a facility built for confidential briefings and diplomatic collaborations, but that now served as a temporary operations hub for the aftermath. He sat with a team of strategists who briefed him on media response, corporate damage control attempts, and the public's growing support. And he said, "Let them say whatever they want now. We don't need narrative, we need consequence." Hours later, a new wave of footage surfaced, not from cameras or passengers, but from employee chat logs, internal training recordings, and whistleblower testimonies from other staff members who had long endured a culture of discrimination but feared losing their jobs if they spoke. But now, with the visibility of Thane's case, they came forward, voices rising from different cities, different fleets, but echoing the same story. And those stories became a dossier. And that dossier became evidence. And that evidence was delivered to the Civil Rights Bureau, the Department of Labor, and the Federal Aviation Administration, triggering full-scale reviews across airline compliance standards, internal reform procedures, and crew certification renewal systems. Meanwhile, Thane sat alone in a quiet room overlooking the skyline, a glass of untouched water beside him, a folder in front of him containing a handwritten letter from a retired pilot who had watched the entire story unfold and written only one line in thick, looping ink: "I thought the sky was big enough for all of us." The storm did not arrive with thunder or fire, but with silence followed by speed. The kind of speed only bureaucracy achieves when truth becomes too loud to ignore and the cost of inaction becomes greater than the price of sacrifice. Within 24 hours of Thane's public disclosure, the airline's executive board convened behind tinted windows in a sterile conference room above their flagship headquarters, their suits dark, their voices strained, their confidence frayed at the seams by the avalanche of evidence that could no longer be buried under PR statements or diversity slogans. And when the final vote was cast, the results were unanimous: immediate dismissal of Veronica Hastings, Chief Flight Operations Lead, along with 2 senior flight coordinators, the captain of the flight, and 3 regional directors who had received prior complaints but failed to act. The termination letters arrived in unmarked envelopes via internal courier, each one stamped urgent, each one ending careers once considered untouchable. Meanwhile, the internal HR system updated in real time, flagging their employee records with a single designation: "Do not rehire," and just beneath that, a note in all caps: "Federal compliance breach under Title VI." At the same moment, regulatory bodies distributed bulletins to all domestic and international aviation partners, alerting them that the individuals involved had been added to an inter-airline blacklist, a list rarely used but always respected, effectively erasing their employability from the entire commercial flight industry. Across terminals from Atlanta to Seattle, their keycards deactivated, their access revoked, their names removed from schedule rosters, their digital profiles deleted as if they had never existed at all. In the stock market, the news struck like lightning through a forest already brittle. Share values plummeted 17% in the first hour of trading, wiping out hundreds of millions in investor equity, while analysts issued emergency revisions to earnings forecasts and public trust indexes collapsed. Talking heads on cable networks debated whether the airline could survive the reputational fallout, with one host stating bluntly, "This is not a PR issue. This is a moral reckoning masquerading as corporate collapse." Protesters gathered outside regional hubs, holding signs that read "Dignity flies too" and "Respect isn't premium." Employees at lower ranks began leaking internal memos that confirmed what the footage had already exposed: a culture of tolerance for quiet bigotry, and an unspoken system of exclusion masquerading as elite customer service. Meanwhile, Veronica sat alone in the kitchen of her suburban home, the envelope still open on the table, its contents undeniable. Her phone had not stopped ringing, not from friends but from journalists, lawyers, and unknown numbers she dared not answer. Her inbox flooded with press inquiries and messages from former colleagues now distancing themselves with phrases like "sorry it came to this," and "I had no idea." She tried to turn on the television, but the news was everywhere. Her name now synonymous with systemic failure. Her photo displayed beneath headlines that asked, "How does this happen in 2025?" and "What else is the industry hiding?" She turned off the screen and opened her laptop to check her professional credentials, only to find her account suspended, her credentials revoked, and her name already scrubbed from the professional registry. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unable to type anything that would undo what had been captured so clearly. Elsewhere, the airline's CEO held a press conference, his face ashen under camera lights, his tone brittle but forced calm, announcing not just apologies, but a full internal audit, the creation of an independent oversight committee, and a suspension of all pending partnerships until further review. But the words felt empty, too late, reactive, not proactive. And the public knew it. Every comment under the live stream demanded more than policy. They demanded proof of change. And Thane, watching from afar, said nothing publicly, made no further statements. Instead, he let the consequences unfold exactly as they were designed to. Because he had not sought revenge, only accountability, not punishment, but correction. And the system now corrected itself with ruthless precision. Some of the passengers who had laughed or whispered or remained silent during the flight began receiving messages of their own, not from the airline, but from employers, from institutions, from organizations that had seen their behavior and could no longer justify their presence in roles of influence or public trust. One investment banker was placed on leave pending review of his conduct. A university administrator resigned after students demanded action. A marketing executive lost several client contracts after her remarks were transcribed and posted on professional forums. And while some cried cancel culture, others called it consequence culture, a shift in societal expectation where silence in the face of injustice was no longer seen as neutral, but as complicity. Thane's name, once unknown to the public, now became a symbol of both restraint and justice. And while some tried to paint him as a disruptor, most saw him for what he was. A man who had every right to retaliate and instead chose to reveal. A man who did not shout but showed. And in showing, changed everything. International media picked up the story, with headlines in London, Sydney, Johannesburg, and Tokyo reflecting the same disbelief and recognition. Commentators linked the event to broader discussions about power, access, and how systems uphold inequality through routine behavior disguised as protocol. Even rival airlines issued statements promising review and reform, not out of guilt, but out of fear that they could be next. Boardrooms across industries asked their compliance officers one simple question: are we protected from our own people? Meanwhile, Thane remained out of the spotlight, his presence felt but not flaunted, letting the ripple effects do the speaking, letting the truth sit on every front page, in every news cycle, in every boardroom. A man who had sat quietly through insult after insult, who had been stripped of dignity in plain sight, now stood not above others, but as a reminder that no seat, no uniform, no logo gives anyone the right to decide who deserves respect, that justice, when silent, is not absent, and when it finally speaks, it rewrites the rules. 1 year later, the world had changed, not in loud proclamations or sudden revolutions, but in the quiet way a current shifts beneath a surface that once seemed calm and unshakable as institutions adjusted, as training manuals were rewritten, as codes of conduct were no longer buried in the back of policy binders, but pinned to the first page in bold type and underlined with intention. And behind every small shift was the memory of that flight, that cabin, that silence, and that man who sat quietly, while the world judged him and found him unworthy, only to discover too late that they had been measuring themselves, not him. It was in this new world that Veronica Hastings sat in front of a camera in a small studio lit not by spectacle, but by truth. Her face older than it had been, her posture humbler, her voice softer and more deliberate. And when the journalist asked what had changed, she didn't blink or deflect or offer a scripted apology. She looked into the lens as if addressing no one and everyone, and said I was taught to be polite but never to question the rules. I believed that standards were objective, that procedures were sacred, that my judgment was professional. But what I learned is that I was not protecting standards, I was protecting comfort. And that comfort came at the expense of others, of people who looked like Thane, people who had to justify their presence every time they stepped into a space that should have welcomed them by default. And I thought silence meant neutrality, but it was compliance. I thought I was doing my job, but I was reinforcing a wall I never built, but chose to maintain. And when she said those words, her eyes welled, not from guilt, but from clarity. And the interviewer did not interrupt, did not redirect, simply allowed her to speak, to unravel, to admit what most people carry all their lives but never face. And the segment aired without cuts or edits. And it resonated more deeply than any corporate press release ever could, because it came not from fear of consequence, but from collision with truth. In the months that followed, Veronica disappeared from the public eye, not to escape, but to learn, to re-enter a world she had long navigated through the lens of power and procedure, but now approached with humility. She enrolled in a civilian flight education program, not as a leader, not as a trainer, but as a student, starting again from the bottom, assigned to read and understand not only safety regulations and hospitality protocols, but cultural sensitivity, systemic bias, and ethical leadership, modules designed and funded by a new foundation created by Thane Garrison, a scholarship program aimed at building inclusive excellence in aviation, open to anyone regardless of background, but focused on uplifting voices long ignored. Veronica applied anonymously, was accepted without favor, and attended her first day of class surrounded by people she would once have judged, seated among men and women whose names she would not have remembered a year ago, now listening, observing, not speaking unless invited to. And she listened more than she had in her entire career, listened to stories of being told to smile more, of being skipped over for promotions, of being doubted for their names, their accents, their skin, and each story chipped away at the foundation she had stood on for decades, a foundation built not on hate, but on assumption, on comfort disguised as fairness, on legacy mistaken for merit, and as the months passed, she stopped seeing herself as the exception and began seeing herself as someone finally allowed to change. On the final day of the program, a speaker was invited to close the session, and when Thane entered the room, there was no fanfare, no announcement, only the sound of seats shifting and hearts adjusting to the presence of someone who had become legend not through noise, but through restraint. He spoke briefly about the sky, about flight, about the power of observation. And then he said, change is not a policy, it is a practice. It is the choice to unlearn, to rebuild, to risk your comfort for someone else's dignity. And then he thanked them, not for completing the course, but for beginning again. After the session ended, Veronica approached slowly, unsure, her hands clasped in front of her. And when their eyes met, she did not offer excuses or explanations. She simply said, I was wrong and thank you. And Thane nodded once, the same quiet nod he had given her a year ago, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. And then he turned and walked away, and this time she did not watch him with suspicion or pride or discomfort. She watched him with understanding, knowing now that his silence had not been weakness, but strength, not compliance, but choice, and that she had not been his adversary, only a reflection of the system he had exposed. Across the industry, more people like Veronica enrolled in the program, more policies were rewritten, more lives were shifted gently onto a new course, not because of one man, but because of the weight of what he carried and the way he chose to carry it. And as Thane stood on the observation deck of a small airfield, months later, watching new graduates take flight in the morning sun, he allowed himself a small smile, not for victory, but for possibility, not because the fight was over, but because the horizon was finally wide enough to belong to everyone. The end. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter in our series. We're just getting started, and your support keeps these stories alive. What part of Thane's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the silence he carried, the moment the truth was revealed, or something else entirely? And tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Let's talk.